In the quiet woods of Cedar Falls, a desperate father and his 10-year-old daughter are about to stumble upon a discovery that will change everything they thought they knew about right and wrong. Evan Brooks never imagined that the cheap metal detector he bought at a garage sale would lead him to a decades-old military secret buried beneath the forest floor. When the device screams to life over what appears to be twisted metal, neither he nor his daughter Sophie realize they're standing above a fortune that could solve all their problems, destroy everything they hold dear. Hidden for over 70 years, a classified World War II transport plane rests in the earth, its cargo hold containing gold bars worth more than most people see in a lifetime. But when word of their discovery spreads through their small town, Evan discovers that some treasures come with a price that money can't measure. What happens when a man who has nothing left to lose finds everything he's ever wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the small two-bedroom house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Evan Brooks stood at the counter, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had seen better days. The coffee was instant. The good stuff had become a luxury he couldn't afford, since Sarah's medical bills had eaten through their savings like a hungry fire. He glanced at the framed photograph on the windowsill, where his wife's gentle smile seemed to catch the early light. Sarah had been gone for 8 months now, but her presence still filled every corner of their modest home. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table beside a bookmark that would never be moved. Her favorite sweater still hung in the closet, unwashed, because it still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume. "Dad, you're doing that thing again," Sophie said, padding into the kitchen in her fuzzy slippers and oversized pajamas. At 10 years old, she possessed an unsettling ability to read his moods, a skill that had developed too quickly in the months since they'd become a family of 2. "What thing?" Evan asked, though he already knew the answer. His daughter had inherited her mother's perceptiveness, along with her dark curls and stubborn chin. "The staring thing. Where you look at Mom's picture, and your face gets all crinkly around the eyes." Sophie climbed onto the kitchen chair, the one with the wobbly leg that he kept meaning to fix, and poured herself a bowl of the store brand cereal that had replaced the name-brand boxes Sarah used to buy. Evan managed a smile. "Sorry, kiddo. Just thinking. About money stuff again." The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd tried so hard to shield her from the weight of their financial struggles, but children had a way of absorbing the anxiety that adults thought they were hiding. The past 8 months had been a constant juggling act: mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries, and the crushing debt left behind by Sarah's final months in the hospital. His job at the Millfield manufacturing plant paid decent wages, but decent wasn't enough when you were supporting a family on a single income and paying off medical bills that seemed to multiply like weeds. "A little," he admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "But nothing for you to worry about, okay? That's my job." Sophie studied him with those serious brown eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Aunt Margaret called last night. I heard you talking to her." Evan's jaw tightened. Margaret Coleman had been Sarah's older sister, and she'd made no secret of her disapproval of the way Evan was raising Sophie. In Margaret's view, a single father working factory shifts was no match for the stability she and her husband Robert could provide in their pristine suburban home 40 miles away. She'd been circling like a vulture ever since the funeral, waiting for Evan to stumble, to prove her point that Sophie would be better off with proper guardians. "What did you hear?" he asked carefully. "She said something about papers, legal papers." Sophie's voice was small, but there was steel underneath it. "She wants me to come live with her, doesn't she?" Evan reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. Her fingers were still sticky from breakfast, and there was a small bandage on her thumb where she'd cut herself helping him fix the back fence last weekend. These were the hands that held his when they watched movies together, that helped him sort through Sarah's things when the grief became too heavy to bear alone. "She thinks it might be better for you," he said honestly. "She has a big house, and Uncle Robert makes good money. They could give you things I can't: piano lessons, a private school, college savings. I don't want piano lessons, Sophie said fiercely. I want to stay here with you. This is our house, Mom's house. I know, sweetheart, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that happens. But he stopped himself before he could voice the fear that kept him awake at night. The fear that Margaret might be right, that love wasn't enough if he couldn't provide for his daughter the way Sarah would have wanted. The conversation was interrupted by the sharp whistle of the kettle. Evan had been heating water for Sophie's hot chocolate-teeth powdered kind that came in little packets, not the rich, creamy version Sarah used to make from scratch. These small compromises had become the markers of their new reality. As he poured the water over the chocolate powder, Evan's mind wandered to the previous weekend's adventure. It had started as a desperate attempt to find something positive to do together, something that didn't cost money they didn't have. The metal detector had been an impulse purchase at a garage sale 3 weeks ago, $15 for a device that probably wasn't worth half that amount. But Sophie had been fascinated by the idea of hunting for treasure, and Evan had latched onto anything that could make her smile the way she used to before her mother got sick. "Are we going treasure hunting again this weekend?" Sophie asked, as if reading his thoughts. "If you want to," Evan said, settling back at the table with his own cup of the instant hot chocolate. "We could try that section of woods behind the old Miller farm. I heard from Jake that nobody's been back there in years." Sophie's eyes lit up, the first genuine excitement he'd seen from her in weeks. "Maybe we'll find something really good this time, like a real treasure chest or old coins or rusty bottle caps and pull tabs from beer cans," Evan said with a gentle laugh. "That's what we found last time, remember?" "But the metal detector made different sounds for different things," Sophie insisted. "You said so yourself. The bottle caps made little beeps, but when we found that old wrench, it made a longer sound. So if we found something really big and really metal, it would make a really long, loud sound, right?" Evan nodded, charmed by her logic. "I suppose it would. Then we just have to keep looking until we hear the right sound," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "Mom always said that good things come to people who don't give up." The mention of Sarah's words of her favorite saying sent a familiar ache through Evan's chest. Sarah had been the eternal optimist, the one who saw possibility where others saw obstacles. She'd been the one to encourage him to take night classes at the community college, to apply for the supervisor position at the plant, to believe that their small dreams could become reality through hard work and persistence. Now, sitting in their kitchen, with the morning light fading and the day's responsibilities looming, Evan tried to channel some of that optimism. The metal detector might be cheap, and their weekend adventures might yield nothing more than trash, but Sophie was right about one thing: they had to keep looking, not just for treasure, but for hope. For a way forward that didn't involve losing each other to the well-meaning interference of relatives who couldn't understand that a family's worth wasn't measured in bank account balances. "You know what?" he said, making a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. "Let's make it a real adventure this weekend. We'll pack sandwiches, bring some thermoses of hot chocolate, and spend the whole day exploring. Who knows? Maybe we'll find something that changes everything." Sophie grinned, the kind of smile that had been rare since Sarah's death, but that transformed her face when it appeared. "Really? The whole day?" "The whole day," Evan confirmed. "Just you and me and that garage sale metal detector, hunting for hope." As they finished their breakfast and began the familiar routine of getting ready for school and work, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that the coming weekend would be different somehow. Maybe it was wishful thinking, or maybe it was the kind of intuition that Sarah had always trusted. Either way, he found himself looking forward to Saturday morning with an anticipation he hadn't felt in months. The metal detector sat in the closet beside their winter coats, its cheap plastic housing and worn instruction manual, a humble reminder that the best treasures often came from the most unexpected places. Just like Sophie herself, a gift he'd never fully appreciated until the possibility of losing her had become real. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of their small house, and Evan pulled Sarah's wedding ring from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying since the funeral, unable to remove it from his finger but equally unable to leave it behind. The gold band caught the kitchen light, and for a moment he could almost hear his wife's voice encouraging him to keep searching, to keep believing that tomorrow might bring the miracle they desperately needed. He slipped the ring back into his pocket and went to help Sophie find her backpack, carrying with him the quiet hope that somewhere in the woods behind the Miller farm, their cheap metal detector might finally beep with the sound of possibility. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel possible. Evan had packed their lunch the night before: peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, apple slices, and 2 thermoses of hot chocolate that would stay warm until noon. Sophie had been awake since dawn, her excitement infectious as she helped him load their gear into the back of his aging pickup truck. The woods behind the Miller farm stretched for nearly 200 acres, a forgotten patch of wilderness that had been left to grow wild since old Henry Miller passed away 5 years ago. His family had moved to the city, leaving the property to the lawyers and tax assessors, while nature slowly reclaimed what had once been careful farmland. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves that crunched under their boots as they made their way along the deer trails that wound between towering oak and maple trees. "This place feels different," Sophie said, adjusting the headphones of the metal detector. They'd agreed to take turns, switching off every 30 minutes so they both got a chance to operate the device. "Older, like it's been waiting for us." Evan smiled at his daughter's poetic observation. Sarah had been the same way, finding meaning and magic in the ordinary moments of life. "It's been here a long time," he agreed. "These trees were probably saplings when your great-grandfather was a boy." They'd been searching for almost 2 hours, finding the usual collection of bottle caps, rusty nails, and unidentifiable metal scraps that seemed to populate every wooded area in America. The metal detector's steady beeping had become a comforting rhythm, punctuated by Sophie's running commentary about the leaves, the birds, and the stories she imagined about the people who might have walked these paths before them. "Dad, listen," Sophie said suddenly, freezing in place. The metal detector in her hands had gone silent, then erupted in a sustained, piercing shriek that was unlike anything they'd heard before. The sound was so loud and insistent that she nearly dropped the device. "Whoa," Evan said, taking the detector from her hands. The needle on the small display was buried in the red zone, and the audio signal continued its urgent wailing. "I've never heard it make a sound like that." He moved the detector in a slow arc, trying to pinpoint the source of the signal. The screaming intensified when he pointed it toward a slight depression in the ground, an area where the earth seemed to dip down beneath a tangle of fallen branches and decades of accumulated leaves. "What do you think it is?" Sophie asked, her voice hushed with anticipation. "I don't know," Evan admitted, kneeling beside the depression. "But it's big, and it's metal, really metal." They began clearing away the debris, working together to remove the branches and sweep aside the thick layer of decomposing leaves. What they found underneath made them both stop and stare in disbelief. Protruding from the earth was a section of corroded metal that looked like nothing either of them had ever seen. It wasn't the smooth, manufactured surface of a car or farm equipment. This metal was riveted with a pattern of bolts and seams that suggested something much older, much more complex. Along one edge, barely visible through the rust and corrosion, were stenciled numbers and what looked like military markings. "Is that?" Sophie began, but Evan held up a hand, his heart suddenly racing. "I think it's part of an airplane," he said quietly, "a very old airplane." They worked with renewed urgency, using their hands and the small folding shovel Evan had brought to carefully excavate around the metal surface. What emerged from the earth was clearly the fuselage of an aircraft, tilted at an angle that suggested it had crashed decades ago and been gradually buried by the natural accumulation of soil and organic matter. The metal detector continued its frantic beeping as they moved it along the exposed surface. Whatever was inside this plane, it was setting off the device, like nothing they'd ever encountered. Through a gap in the corroded metal section that looked like it had been torn open during the crash, they could see into the aircraft's interior. That's when they saw the gleam. Even filtered through decades of dirt and tarnish, the golden reflection was unmistakable. Stacked inside the cargo hold of the old plane were rectangular objects that could only be one thing: gold bars. Dozens of them, arranged in neat rows that spoke of military precision and careful transport. "Oh my God," Evan whispered, his voice barely audible over the metal detector's insistent wailing. Sophie pressed closer to the opening, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is that really gold, Dad? Like, real gold?" Evan reached through the gap and touched one of the bars. Despite the crash and the years underground, the metal felt solid and heavy in his hands. When he pulled it into the sunlight, there was no mistaking what it was: a gold bar with military markings stamped into its surface. "It's real," he said, his mind reeling with the implications. "Sophie, this is real gold, a lot of real gold." They sat in stunned silence beside the buried plane, the metal detector finally quiet in Evan's hands. The October sun filtered through the trees above them, casting dappled shadows across what had to be the most significant discovery in Cedar Falls history. But as the initial shock began to wear off, other thoughts crept into Evan's mind. "Dad," Sophie said slowly, "what are we supposed to do with this?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Evan looked at his daughter, then at the gold bar in his hands, then back at the plane that had been hidden in these woods for what looked like 70 years or more. The responsible thing would be to call the authorities, to report the discovery, and let the government or the military or whoever handled such things take over. But the responsible thing wouldn't pay off Sarah's medical bills. It wouldn't secure Sophie's future or prevent Margaret from filing her custody petition. It wouldn't solve any of the problems that kept Evan awake at night, staring at the ceiling while he calculated and recalculated their diminishing finances. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I need to think about this." They spent the next hour carefully covering the plane with branches and leaves, disguising their excavation work so that the site looked undisturbed. The metal detector had revealed what appeared to be a substantial cargo hold full of gold bars, but they'd only removed the one evidence of their discovery, but not enough to constitute theft. At least, that's what Evan told himself as they packed their gear and headed back to the truck. The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Sophie clutched the gold bar in her lap, turning it over in her hands and studying the military markings that were stamped into its surface. The numbers and letters meant nothing to either of them, but they spoke of official government business and classified operations. "Are we going to tell anyone?" Sophie asked as they pulled into their driveway. Evan sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at their small house with its peeling paint and sagging front porch. Through the kitchen window, he could see Sarah's picture on the windowsill, her smile seeming to ask him what he was going to do with this impossible gift. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let's keep this between us for now, okay? Just until I figure out what the right thing to do is." Sophie nodded solemnly, understanding that they were entering territory that went beyond their weekend treasure-hunting adventures. This was real treasure, the kind that could change everything if they were brave enough to claim it. As they carried their gear into the house, Evan's mind was already racing ahead to the questions that would keep him awake tonight. Who had been flying that plane? Where had they been taking the gold? And most importantly, what would happen to him and Sophie if anyone found out what they'd discovered in the woods behind the Miller farm? The gold bar sat on their kitchen table like a golden question mark, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and Evan couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet life in Cedar Falls was about to become much more complicated. The Cedar Falls Public Library had seen better days. Built in 1962 with federal funding, it bore the hallmarks of mid-century optimism: clean lines, large windows, and a faith in the power of knowledge to improve lives. Now, 50 years later, the building showed its age in cracked linoleum and outdated computer terminals, but the books remained, and more importantly, the librarian knew how to find information that wasn't available online. Evans sat at a corner table Monday evening, having driven straight from the plant to spend his dinner break researching military aircraft. Sophie was at Jake's house, working on a school projector, convenient arrangement that gave Evan the privacy he needed to investigate their discovery without raising questions. "Find anything interesting?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian who'd been helping Cedar Falls residents navigate the world of information for nearly 3 decades. She approached his table with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen every possible research request and was prepared to help with any of them. "Maybe," Evan said, glancing up from the book he'd been studying. "I'm trying to identify a military aircraft, World War II era, probably a transport plane. It would have been carrying cargo, not passengers." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up with professional interest. "That's quite specific. Are you working on a history project?" "Something like that," Evan said, which was true enough. "I found some metal in the woods that looks like it might be from a plane crash. I'm curious about what kind of aircraft it might have been." The librarian disappeared into the stacks and returned with several additional books, including a comprehensive guide to military aircraft of the 1940s and a volume on wartime logistics and transport operations. "These should help," she said. "The transport planes were usually C-47s or C-54s, depending on the cargo and the distance. Is there anything specific about the metal that might help identify the model?" Evan described the riveting pattern and the size of the metal fragments he'd observed, carefully omitting any mention of the gold or the intact nature of the wreckage. Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully and made notes on a small pad. "You know," she said, "there were rumors during the war about classified flights through this area. Nothing officially documented, of course, but my father used to tell stories about planes flying over at night, heading east toward the coast. He was in the Coast Guard then, stationed down in Baltimore, and he always said there was more military traffic through these parts than anyone talked about." The comment sent a chill through Evan's chest. If there had been classified flights through the area, then the plane they'd found might have been on a mission that was still sensitive, still important to people who had the power to make their lives very difficult. He spent the next 2 hours poring over technical specifications and historical accounts, gradually building a picture of what their discovery might be. The aircraft appeared to be a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a 4-engine transport plane that had been the workhorse of military logistics during World War II. The C-54 could carry up to 18,000 pounds of cargo across distances of over 2,000 miles, perfect for transporting valuable materials across the continent. But it was in a smaller volume about wartime financial operations that Evan found the information that made his blood run cold. The book contained a brief mention of Operation Bernhard, a Nazi counterfeiting operation that had produced millions of dollars in fake British pounds. The Allied response had included the transport of gold reserves and other precious metals to secure locations, often using unmarked military aircraft to avoid detection by enemy agents. The implications were staggering. If the plane in the woods had been carrying gold as part of a classified operation, then the contents of that cargo hold might belong to the United States government. Taking it wouldn't just be theft, it would be theft of military property, possibly classified military property. Evan closed the books and sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of knowledge settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The gold bar, hidden in his bedroom dresser, suddenly felt less like a solution to their problems and more like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Sophie's done with her project. Want me to drop her off, or do you want to pick her up?" "I'll pick her up," Evan replied, grateful for the excuse to leave the library and its troubling revelations behind. Jake Morrison lived in a neat ranch house on the other side of Cedar Falls, in a neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed and the driveways were recently paved. He'd been Evan's best friend since high school, and their relationship had deepened after Sarah's death, when Jake had stepped up to help with everything from home repairs to emergency babysitting. "How's the research going?" Jake asked as they stood in his driveway, watching Sophie gather her school supplies from the back seat of Jake's truck. "Complicated," Evan said, then lowered his voice. Jake, can I ask you something hypothetical? Sure. If someone found something valuable, something that might have been lost or abandoned, what would be the right thing to do? Jake studied his friend's face, clearly sensing that this wasn't an idle philosophical question. Depends on what it is, I guess, and how valuable we're talking about. Very valuable, life-changing, valuable. Then I'd say it depends on whether anyone's still looking for it, and whether taking it would hurt anyone. Jake paused, then added, "This is about more than bottle caps and rusty nails, isn't it?" Evan glanced towards Sophie, who was still organizing her backpack and couldn't hear their conversation. What would you do if you found something that could solve all your problems, but taking it might not be entirely legal? I'd probably want to know more about where it came from and who it belonged to, Jake said carefully. And I'd want to make sure I wasn't making my problems worse by trying to solve them. The conversation was interrupted by Sophie's emergence from the truck, her arms full of poster board and art supplies. "Dad, look what Mrs. Morrison helped me make for my presentation." She held up a colorful poster about local history, complete with photographs and historical timeline. "It's about Cedar Falls during World War II. Did you know there used to be a military checkpoint on the highway, and that there were rumors about secret government flights through the area?" Evan felt his stomach drop. "Where did you hear about that?" Mrs. Morrison found it in her grandfather's old diary. He was a volunteer air raid warden during the war, and he wrote about seeing planes flying over at night with their lights off. He thought they might have been carrying important cargo or government officials. Jake's wife appeared in the doorway, smiling at Sophie's enthusiasm. "She's quite the little historian," she said. "She asked such good questions about the diary that I let her photocopy some of the pages for her project." As they drove home, Sophie chatted excitedly about her research and the stories she'd uncovered about their town's wartime history. Evan tried to listen, but his mind kept returning to the implications of what he'd learned at the library and what Sophie had discovered independently. If there had been secret flights through the area, and if local residents had noticed them enough to write about them in personal diaries, then the plane they'd found might have been part of a larger operation. The gold could be connected to classified military activities, which meant that claiming it could bring unwanted attention from federal authorities. But as they pulled into their driveway and he saw the stack of bills on the kitchen counter through the window, Evan realized that the alternative, doing nothing, might be just as dangerous. Margaret's custody petition was moving forward, and their financial situation was getting worse, not better. The gold bar in his dresser drawer represented more than money. It represented the possibility of keeping his family together, of honoring Sarah's memory by ensuring that their daughter grew up in the home her mother had loved. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Evan sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began making lists. On one side, he wrote down everything they knew about the plane and its cargo. On the other side, he wrote down everything they needed to find out before making any decisions. The questions outnumbered the answers by a significant margin, but one thing was becoming clear. Their weekend treasure hunting adventure had led them into territory that was far more complex than either of them had imagined. The cheap metal detector had worked exactly as advertised, leading them to metal buried in the woods. The problem was that some buried metal was more complicated than others. Sophie's behavior at school had become noticeably different, though she was trying hard to act normal. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had mentioned it to Evan during pickup on Wednesday afternoon, expressing concern about Sophie's distracted demeanor and her newfound fascination with treasure hunting and military history. "She's been drawing maps during math class," Mrs. Henderson explained, walking beside Evan toward the school's main exit. "Very detailed maps, with symbols and locations marked. When I asked her about them, she said she was planning treasure hunting expeditions with her father." Evan felt a familiar twist of anxiety in his stomach. "She's been excited about our weekend metal detecting trips. It's been good for her, having something to look forward to." "Oh, I think it's wonderful that you two have found an activity you enjoy together," Mrs. Henderson assured him. "It's just that she seems to have something specific in mind now. She keeps talking about finding the big treasure and how it's going to solve all their problems." The phrase hit Evan like a physical blow. He'd been so careful not to discuss their financial situation in front of Sophie, but children absorbed more than adults realized. She'd obviously picked up on the stress in their household and had latched onto their discovery as the solution to problems she shouldn't have to worry about. "I'll talk to her," Evan said. "Maybe we've been building up the treasure hunting too much. I don't want her to think it's about the money." But even as he said it, Evan knew he was lying to himself as much as to Mrs. Henderson. It was about the money. It was about the custody battle with Margaret, about the medical bills, about the future he was struggling to provide for his daughter. The gold bars in that crashed plane represented everything they needed to build a stable life together. That evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table working on her homework, but her attention kept drifting to the notebook beside her math worksheet. Evan could see that she'd been writing lists of her own, and the few words he could make out from across the room sent another chill through him. "What are you working on over there?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Sophie looked up guiltily, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "Just some ideas," she said, closing the notebook quickly. "Ideas about what?" "About what we could do with the treasure money." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for days. "I know we're not supposed to talk about it, but I can't stop thinking about it, Dad. That gold could fix everything, couldn't it?" Evan took the notebook gently from her hands and opened it to the page she'd been working on. What he found there broke his heart. Written in Sophie's careful 10-year-old handwriting was a list titled, "Things we could buy with treasure money. Pay off Mom's hospital bills. Fix the roof so it doesn't leak in my bedroom. Buy real groceries instead of store brand. Get a new car that doesn't make scary noises. Pay for college so I can be a teacher like Mom wanted. Buy Aunt Margaret a present so she won't be mad at us anymore. Get Dad a new work shirt that doesn't have holes. Put flowers on Mom's grave. Every week instead of just special days." The list continued for another dozen items, each one a small heartbreak that revealed how much Sophie had been worrying about things that should have been his responsibility alone. At the bottom of the page, she'd written, "Maybe if we have enough money, everything will be okay again." "Oh, sweetheart," Evan said, pulling her into his arms. "You shouldn't have to worry about any of these things. That's not your job." "But I do worry," Sophie said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I hear you talking on the phone to people about money, and I see how you count the bills at the kitchen table when you think I'm not watching. And I know Aunt Margaret thinks you can't take care of me because we don't have enough money." The honesty in her voice was devastating. Evan realized that his efforts to shield her from their financial struggles had been less successful than he'd imagined. Sophie was carrying the weight of their family's problems on her 10-year-old shoulders, and the discovery of the gold had given her hope for a solution that might not be possible. "Listen to me," he said, holding her at arm's length so he could look into her eyes. "I love you more than anything in the world, and I'm going to take care of you no matter what. We don't need treasure to be okay. We need each other." "But the gold could help, couldn't it?" Sophie insisted. "We found it fair and square. It's not like we stole it from someone." The question hung in the air between them, and Evan realized that he didn't have a good answer. Was it stealing if the original owners were long dead? Was it wrong to claim something that had been abandoned in the woods for 70 years? And what about Sophie's future? Didn't he owe it to her to explore every possibility for securing her well-being? Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into their driveway. Through the kitchen window, Evan could see a black sedan with tinted windows, not the kind of car that belonged to anyone they knew in Cedar Falls. "Stay here," he told Sophie, moving to the front door as the car's engine shut off. Two men emerged from the sedan, both wearing dark suits that looked expensive and out of place in their modest neighborhood. The older man appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of military bearing that spoke of decades in uniform. The younger man was perhaps 30, with sharp eyes and the alert posture of someone accustomed to potential danger. The older man approached the front door, while his companion remained beside the car, hands clasped behind his back in a position that suggested he was scanning the area for threats. "Mr. Brooks?" the older man said when Evan opened the door. My name is Pete Morrison. I'd like to speak with you about some recent activities in the woods behind the Miller farm." Evan's blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Morrison said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of authority. "I think you and your daughter have been doing some metal detecting in that area. And I think you've found something that's been missing for a very long time." The directness of the statement caught Evan off guard. He'd expected to have more time to figure out their next move, but somehow this man already knew about their discovery. "I'm going to ask you again," Morrison continued, "and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Have you found anything unusual in the woods behind the Miller farm?" Evan glanced back toward the kitchen, where Sophie was undoubtedly listening to every word of this conversation. The list of things they could buy with treasure money was still sitting on the table, evidence of how much hope his daughter had invested in their discovery. "Who are you?" Evan asked. "I'm someone who's been looking for that plane for a very long time," Morrison replied. "And I'm someone who might be able to help you navigate the complicated situation you found yourself in." The implication was clear. Morrison already knew about the plane, knew about the gold, and knew that Evan and Sophie were in over their heads. The only question was whether he was there to help them or to take away the one thing that might solve their problems. "I think you should come inside," Evan said finally, stepping aside to let Morrison enter their home. As the man in the expensive suit crossed their threshold, Evan realized that their quiet life in Cedar Falls was about to become much more complicated. The gold bars in the crashed plane weren't just valuable, they were important enough to bring federal agents or military officials to his front door on a Wednesday evening. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her notebook clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. The treasure money on her list suddenly seemed less like a solution and more like the beginning of a problem that was far bigger than anything a 10-year-old should have to understand. Pete Morrison sat at their kitchen table like a man who'd been expecting this conversation for years. He'd declined Evan's offer of coffee, instead producing a small leather portfolio that contained documents and photographs that looked both official and classified. Sophie remained in the doorway, uncertain whether she should join them or disappear into her bedroom. "It's okay, sweetheart," Morrison said, noticing her hesitation. "This concerns you too, and I believe children should understand the truth when it affects their lives." Morrison opened his portfolio and withdrew a black and white photograph that showed a military aircraft on what appeared to be a wartime airfield. The plane was identical to the wreckage they'd found in the woods, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster with military markings and the same distinctive riveting pattern. This photograph was taken in March 1945 at a classified airfield in Maryland, Morrison explained. The aircraft was designated Transport 7 Alpha, and it was carrying a cargo of gold bullion from a Federal Reserve facility to a secure location on the East Coast. The plane and its crew disappeared somewhere over the Appalachian Mountains during a severe storm. Evan studied the photograph, noting the 3 crew members standing beside the aircraft. They were young men, probably in their 20s, with the serious expressions of people who understood they were involved in something important and dangerous. "What happened to the crew?" Sophie asked, moving closer to the table. Morrison's expression softened. "They were listed as missing in action. Their families were told that the aircraft had been lost during a classified mission, but the details were kept secret for national security reasons. The cargo was never recovered." "And you've been looking for it ever since?" Evan asked. "Not me personally," Morrison said. "I'm retired military, but I've been researching this case for the past 15 years. The families of those crew members deserve to know what happened to their sons and fathers. And the government deserves to recover property that was stolen from the American people." The word "stolen" hung in the air like an accusation. Evan felt Sophie's eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to the suggestion that their discovery belonged to someone else. "We haven't stolen anything," Evan said carefully. "We found something in the woods while we were metal detecting. That's not the same thing as theft." "Under normal circumstances, I'd agree with you," Morrison said. "But this isn't normal circumstances. That gold was part of a classified operation, and taking it would constitute theft of federal property. The penalties for that kind of crime are severe. Morrison reached into his portfolio again and withdrew a second photograph, this one showing a military medal mounted in a presentation case. This belonged to Technical Sergeant William Morrison, the flight engineer on Transport 77 Alpha. He was my grandfather. The revelation explained Morrison's personal interest in the case, but it also complicated the moral equation. This wasn't just about government property, it was about a family's need for closure and a grandson's quest to honor his grandfather's memory. I've spent years researching the flight path and the weather conditions that night, Morrison continued. I've interviewed surviving personnel from the airfield, studied radar records, and analyzed terrain maps. Everything pointed to a crash somewhere in this region, but the exact location remained a mystery until now. Sophie had been listening intently, and now she spoke up with the directness that children often brought to complicated adult situations. So, if we tell you where the plane is, what happens to the gold? Morrison smiled at her question. That would depend on several factors. The gold belongs to the federal government, but there are provisions for finder's fees in cases like this. People who help recover lost or stolen federal property can receive compensation for their assistance. How much compensation? Evan asked. Typically, between 5 and 10% of the recovered value, Morrison said. If the cargo is worth what I believe it is, that could be a substantial amount of money. Evan did the math quickly in his head. If the plane contained gold worth $100 million, even a 5% finder's fee would be $5 million enough to solve all their problems and secure Sophie's future without the moral complications of claiming the entire treasure. But before he could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of another vehicle pulling into their driveway. Through the kitchen window, Evan could see a white panel van with no identifying markings, followed by a second black sedan identical to the one Morrison had arrived in. Morrison's expression changed immediately, his relaxed demeanor replaced by alert tension. "That's not good," he said, moving to the window to get a better view of the vehicles. "Who is it?" Evan asked. "Private security, military contractors." Morrison's voice carried a note of urgency. "They're here for the same reason I am, but they're not interested in following proper legal channels." The van's rear doors opened, and 4 men in tactical gear emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. They were armed with automatic weapons and wearing communication equipment that suggested they were part of a larger operation. "We need to leave," Morrison said, closing his portfolio and standing up from the table. "Right now." "Leave and go where?" Evan asked. "This is our home." "Your home isn't safe anymore," Morrison replied. "The moment you found that plane, you became a target for every treasure hunter, mercenary, and government contractor who's been looking for it. Some of them are more ethical than others." Sophie moved closer to her father, her earlier excitement about the treasure replaced by fear. "Dad, what's happening?" Before Evan could answer, there was a sharp knock at the front door, the kind of knock that wasn't really a request for entry, but a warning that entry was coming whether they wanted it or not. Morrison grabbed Sophie's hand and motioned for Evan to follow him toward the back door. "Is there another way out of here?" "Through the backyard," Evan said, his mind racing. "There's a gate that leads to the alley behind the house." They moved quickly through the kitchen, Morrison leading the way with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with similar situations before. As they reached the back door, they could hear the front door being forced open and the sound of boots on the hardwood floors of their living room. "Stay low and stay quiet," Morrison whispered as they slipped out into the backyard. "These people aren't here to negotiate." They made their way across the yard in the darkness, using the fence and the large oak tree as cover. Behind them, they could see flashlight beams moving through the windows of their house as the armed men searched the interior. The alley behind their house was dark and quiet, lined with garbage cans and the rear entrances to other modest homes. Morrison led them to a small sedan parked 2 blocks away, a vehicle that looked ordinary enough to avoid attracting attention. "Get in," he said, opening the rear door for Sophie. "We need to put some distance between us and those men." As they drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Evan tried to process what had just happened. Their peaceful life had been shattered in the space of a few hours, and now they were fleeing their own home with a man they'd met less than an hour ago. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Somewhere safe," Morrison replied. "Somewhere we can figure out our next move without worrying about armed contractors breaking down the door." In the back seat, Sophie was clutching her notebook, the one with the list of things they could buy with treasure money. The innocent dreams written in her careful handwriting now seemed like relics from a simpler time, before they'd learned that finding treasure was only the beginning of their problems. The gold bars in the crashed plane had seemed like the answer to everything. Now they were beginning to understand that some answers came with questions that were more dangerous than the original problems. The Cedar Falls Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the town's main street, a building that had been donated to the community in 1976 by the last surviving member of the founding family. Morrison had driven them there through back roads and residential streets, checking his mirrors constantly for signs of pursuit. "Why here?" Evan asked as they pulled into the parking lot beside the building. "Because it's the last place they'd think to look," Morrison replied. "And because the person who runs this place has information we need." The building was dark except for a single light in the upstairs window, but Morrison seemed to know exactly where he was going. He led them around to a side entrance and knocked on the door in a specific pattern: 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a cardigan over a simple dress, and her hands showed the careful maintenance of someone who spent her days handling delicate documents and precious artifacts. "Pete," she said, her voice carrying both warmth and concern. "I've been expecting you, but I didn't think you'd be bringing company." "Emergency circumstances, Eleanor," Morrison replied. "We need a safe place to talk, and we need access to your wartime records." Eleanor stepped aside to let them enter, her gaze lingering on Sophie with the kind of maternal concern that came naturally to women who'd spent their lives caring for community institutions. "Come in, all of you. The coffee's still warm from this afternoon." The interior of the Historical Society was exactly what Evan had expected. Dark wood paneling, display cases filled with local artifacts, and the musty smell of old books and aging paper. Eleanor led them through the main exhibition hall to a small office in the rear of the building where file cabinets lined the walls and a desk was covered with research materials. "Eleanor Hartwell," Morrison said by way of introduction. "Meet Evan Brooks and his daughter Sophie. They're the ones who found it." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I see. And I assume from the circumstances of your arrival that others have learned about the discovery as well." "Armed contractors," Morrison confirmed. "They hit the house about 30 minutes after I arrived. We barely got out." Eleanor moved to the window and peered through the blinds at the street below. "Then we don't have much time. They'll expand their search pattern once they realize you've left the immediate area." She moved to one of the file cabinets and withdrew a manila folder that looked like it had been handled frequently over the years. "I've been researching Transport 77 Alpha since Pete first contacted me about his grandfather's disappearance. What I found was more complicated than either of us expected." She spread the contents of the folder across her desk: photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a wartime manifest written in faded carbon copy. The photograph that caught Evan's attention immediately was a group shot of military personnel standing in front of the same aircraft they'd seen in Morrison's portfolio. "This was taken 3 days before the flight," Eleanor explained. "But look carefully at the background." She pointed to a section of the photograph where several wooden crates were visible beside the aircraft. Stenciled on the sides of the crates were symbols that looked distinctly non-American eagles and swastikas that left no doubt about their origin. "The gold wasn't American federal property," Eleanor said quietly. "It was Nazi treasure that had been recovered by Allied forces at the end of the war. The plane was carrying it to a federal facility where it would be catalogued and eventually returned to the families and institutions it had been stolen from." The revelation hit Evan like a physical blow. If the gold belonged to Holocaust survivors and their descendants, then claiming it wasn't just theft from the government here, was theft from people who had already lost everything once before. Sophie, who had been studying the photographs with intense concentration, looked up at the adults around her. So the treasure belongs to families who had it stolen by bad people? That's right, Eleanor said gently. The Nazi regime stole gold, artwork, and other valuables from Jewish families and other victims across Europe. After the war, the Allied forces worked to return these items to their rightful owners or their surviving family members. Morrison added, the manifest lists the intended recipients' families in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia who had submitted claims for recovery of stolen property. Some of them are probably still alive, and most of them certainly have children and grandchildren who would be the legal heirs. Evan felt the moral foundation of their situation shift completely. What had seemed like a grey area claiming abandoned treasure was now clearly black and white. The gold belonged to specific people who had suffered unimaginable losses, and returning it wasn't just the legal thing to do, it was the only decent thing to do. But that doesn't explain why private contractors are involved, he said. If this is about returning stolen property to Holocaust survivors, why aren't we dealing with the FBI or some other government agency? Eleanor and Morrison exchanged a meaningful look before Eleanor answered. Because some of the families who filed claims have hired private recovery firms to locate their stolen property. These firms work on contingency. They keep a percentage of whatever they recover. It's become a very lucrative business. And some of these firms aren't particularly concerned with legal niceties, Morrison added. They're more interested in finding the treasure and working out the ownership issues later. The sound of vehicles in the street outside interrupted their conversation. Eleanor moved back to the window and peered through the blinds, her face grim. 3 vehicles, she reported. The same white van from your description, plus 2 additional cars. They're checking buildings systematically. Morrison stood up and began gathering the documents from Eleanor's desk. We need to move again. Is there a back way out of here? Through the basement, Eleanor said. There's a tunnel that connects to the old bank building next door. It was part of the Underground Railroad network during the Civil War. As they prepared to leave, Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. Dad, if the gold belongs to families who had everything stolen from them, then we have to give it back, right? Even if it means we can't solve our money problems. The question was asked with the moral clarity that children often brought to complex situations, and it cut straight through all of Evan's rationalizations and justifications. His daughter was right, of course. The gold belonged to people who had suffered far worse losses than their family had endured. Yes, he said, the word coming out with more conviction than he'd felt in weeks. We have to give it back. Eleanor smiled at Sophie's wisdom. You're a very wise young lady. Your mother would be proud of you. As they made their way through the basement toward the hidden tunnel, Evan realized that their treasure hunt had evolved into something much more important than solving their financial problems. They were now part of a story that stretched back 70 years, involving families who had lost everything and deserved to have at least some small part of their heritage returned to them. The gold bars in the crashed plane weren't their salvation, they were their responsibility. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, armed men were searching for the same treasure with very different intentions. The tunnel beneath the Historical Society was older than the building above it, carved from stone and brick in an era when Cedar Falls had been a crucial stop on the Underground Railroad. Eleanor led them through the narrow passage with a flashlight, her footsteps sure despite the uneven floor and low ceiling. This connects to the basement of the old First National Bank building, she explained as they walked. The bank's been closed for 15 years, but I still have keys. We can use the main floor as a temporary safe house while we figure out our next move. The tunnel emerged into a basement that smelled of damp concrete and abandonment. Eleanor led them up a narrow staircase to the bank's main floor, where dusty teller windows and an empty vault created an atmosphere of faded prosperity. Morrison immediately went to the windows, checking the street for signs of the security contractors. They're still searching the Historical Society, he reported. but they'll expand their perimeter soon enough. Eleanor moved to an old desk in what had been the bank manager's office and withdrew a different folder, this one, much thicker than the previous collection of documents. "There's something else you need to know about Transport 77 Alpha," she said. "Something I didn't want to discuss in front of the contractors who might have been listening." She opened the folder to reveal a collection of documents that looked different from the military records they'd seen before. These papers were older, written in multiple languages, and bore official seals from various European governments. After Pete first contacted me about his grandfather's flight, I began researching not just the plane but the cargo manifest in detail, Eleanor explained. What I found was that the gold being transported wasn't just any Nazi treasurette, was part of a specific collection that had been stolen from a single source. She withdrew a document with a letterhead in German and what appeared to be an official translation attached. "This is a claim filed with the Allied Recovery Commission in 1946. It's from the Rosenberg family of Vienna, requesting the return of gold bullion that had been confiscated from their private bank by Nazi authorities in 1938. Evan studied the document, trying to understand the implications. "So the gold belonged to a specific family?" "Not just any family," Eleanor said. "The Rosenbergs were one of the wealthiest banking families in pre-war Austria. They specialized in helping Jewish families and businesses transfer assets out of Nazi-occupied territories. When the Nazis took over Austria, they specifically targeted the Rosenberg Bank because of the family's resistance activities." Morrison looked up from his position at the window. "Are you saying the gold in that plane belonged to people who were actively fighting the Nazis?" "More than that," Eleanor replied. "According to these documents, the gold wasn't just the Rosenberg family's personal wealth. It was gold that had been entrusted to them by dozens of other families who were trying to escape Nazi persecution. The Rosenbergs were essentially running an underground bank, helping people smuggle their life savings out of occupied Europe." Sophie, who had been listening intently, spoke up with the directness that had become familiar. "So if the bad guys stole gold from people who were trying to help other people escape, then giving it back is even more important, right?" Eleanor smiled at the girl's moral clarity. "Exactly right. But here's where it gets complicated and why those armed contractors are so interested in finding the crash site." She withdrew another set of documents, these bearing more recent dates and official letterheads from law firms in New York and Philadelphia. "I've been in contact with some of the surviving Rosenberg family members. Most of the original generation died during the war, but there are grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have been fighting legal battles for decades to recover their family's stolen assets. And they hired private recovery firms to help with the search," Morrison concluded. "Some of them did," Eleanor confirmed. "But others have been working through official channels, trying to get government assistance with the recovery process. The problem is that different branches of the family have hired different firms, and they're not all working toward the same goal." Eleanor spread out a family tree that showed the complex relationships between various Rosenberg descendants. This branch of the family, based in New York, hired a legitimate firm that works closely with the FBI and other federal agencies. They're interested in recovering the gold and distributing it according to the original trust documents. She pointed to another section of the family tree. But this branch, based in Philadelphia, hired a more aggressive firm, the one that sent those contractors to your house tonight. They're arguing that the gold belongs exclusively to their branch of the family, and they're willing to use questionable methods to recover it. The sound of vehicles outside interrupted Eleanor's explanation. Morrison moved back to the window and swore under his breath. "They've found us. 3 cars, and they're setting up a perimeter around the building." Eleanor moved quickly to gather the documents. "There's another way out through the old pneumatic tube system. It connects to the post office across the street." But before they could move, they heard the sound of the bank's front door being forced open. Heavy footsteps echoed across the main floor as armed men entered the building. "This is Marcus Reed," a voice called out from the lobby. "I represent the Rosenberg Recovery Foundation. I know you're in here, and I know you've found what we're looking for." Morrison motioned for Evan and Sophie to stay low behind the teller counter, while Eleanor continued gathering documents. "What do you want?" Morrison called back. "I want to talk," Reed replied. "No weapons, no threats. Just a conversation about a mutually beneficial arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Evan asked, his voice carrying across the empty bank. Reed's footsteps moved closer to their location. "The kind where everyone gets what they want. You get a substantial finder's fee, my clients get their family's stolen property back, and nobody has to involve federal authorities in what could become a very complicated legal situation." Eleanor shook her head vigorously, whispering, "Don't trust him. The Philadelphia branch has been fighting the other family members in court for 20 years. They're not interested in sharing anything with anyone." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad, how do we know which family members are the right ones? What if there are different people who all think the gold belongs to them?" The question cut to the heart of their dilemma. Even if they wanted to do the right thing and return the gold to its rightful owners, how could they determine who those rightful owners were when different branches of the same family were making competing claims? Reed's voice carried a note of impatience. "I'm going to give you 60 seconds to come out and discuss this like reasonable adults. After that, my team is going to conduct a thorough search of this building, and the conversation is going to become much less friendly." Morrison looked at Evan and Sophie, then at Eleanor, who was clutching the folder of documents against her chest. "What do you think? Do we try to negotiate, or do we run?" Eleanor moved to a section of the wall behind the bank manager's desk and pressed against what appeared to be a decorative panel. To everyone's surprise, the panel swung inward to reveal a hidden passage. "The pneumatic tube system," she whispered. "It was designed to transfer documents between the bank and the post office, but it's large enough for people to crawl through. It comes out in the post office basement." Reed's countdown continued from the lobby. 30 seconds. Sophie made the decision for all of them. "We run," she said firmly. "If we can't figure out who the gold really belongs to, then we need more time to find out. And we can't do that if those men take us somewhere we can't leave." Her logic was unassailable. They needed time to research the competing claims and determine the best way to return the gold to its rightful owners. Most importantly, they needed to maintain their freedom to make moral choices rather than being forced into arrangements that benefited treasure hunters more than Holocaust survivors. One by one, they crawled through the hidden passage, Eleanor's flashlight providing the only illumination in the narrow space. Behind them, they could hear Reed's men beginning their search of the bank building, their heavy footsteps and radio chatter growing fainter as the passage carried them toward the post office. As they emerged into the basement of the abandoned post office, Evan realized that their simple treasure hunt had become something much more complex than he'd ever imagined. They weren't just dealing with lost cargo from a military transport. They were caught in the middle of a family feud that had been simmering for 70 years, involving people who had suffered unimaginable losses and deserved justice, not just profit. The post office basement felt like a tomb, filled with decades of accumulated mail sacks and postal equipment that had been abandoned when the building was closed in 2008. Eleanor's flashlight revealed a maze of sorting tables and mail slots, all covered with a thick layer of dust that spoke to how long it had been since anyone had disturbed this space. "We can't stay here long," Morrison whispered, checking his watch. "Reed's people will figure out where we went once they finish searching the bank." Eleanor was already moving toward a different section of the basement, where a metal staircase led to what appeared to be a loading dock. "My car is parked behind the library, about 2 blocks from here. If we can make it there without being seen, we can get out of town and figure out our next move." Evan pulled Sophie close to him, noting how calm she seemed, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their evening. His 10-year-old daughter was handling armed pursuit and underground tunnels with a composure that both impressed and worried him. "Are you okay, kiddo?" he asked quietly. "I'm scared," Sophie admitted, "but I keep thinking about what Mom used to say about doing the right thing even when it's hard. She always said that the hardest choices are usually the most important ones." Her words hit Evan with the force of recognition. Sarah had indeed said that, usually when she was encouraging him to stand up to his supervisor at the plant or to speak honestly with Sophie about difficult subjects. The memory of his wife's moral courage strengthened his resolve to see this situation through to an honorable conclusion. Eleanor led them up the metal stairs to the loading dock, where large doors opened onto an alley that ran behind the downtown business district. The night air was cold and still, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of vehicles moving through the streets. "Stay close," Morrison instructed as they made their way through the alley. "And remember, if we get separated, the rendezvous point is the library parking lot." They moved in single file along the shadows cast by the buildings, Eleanor leading the way with the confidence of someone who'd walked these streets for decades. As they approached the corner where the alley intersected with Main Street, Morrison held up a hand to signal them to stop. A black sedan was parked across the street from the library, its engine running and its headlights off. Even from their position in the alley, they could see two figures sitting in the front seat, clearly watching the library and its surrounding area. "They're learning," Morrison said grimly. "Reed's people are thinking ahead, positioning themselves at likely escape routes." Eleanor studied the situation for a moment, then motioned for them to follow her back into the alley. "There's another way," she said. "Through the old merchant's tunnel system that connects most of the downtown buildings. It's not as well maintained as the one we just used, but it should get us to the library basement without being seen." She led them to what appeared to be a maintenance shed behind one of the shops, where a heavy wooden door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" stood partially concealed by overgrown shrubs. Eleanor produced an old-fashioned skeleton key from her pocket and unlocked the door to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "This dates back to the 1920s, she explained as they descended. "During Prohibition, the local merchants used these tunnels to move bootleg liquor between the speakeasies and the railroad depot. Most people have forgotten they exist." The tunnel was rougher than the previous passages they'd used, with stone walls that wept moisture and a ceiling low enough to force them to walk in a crouch. But it was clearly still functional, and Eleanor moved through it with the assurance of someone who'd used it before. As they walked, Sophie broke the tense silence with a question that revealed how much she'd been thinking about their situation. "Mrs. Hartwell, when we give the gold back to the right people, how will we know we picked the right ones?" Eleanor smiled in the flashlight's glow. "That's the most important question anyone's asked tonight. The truth is, there probably isn't a single right answer. Different branches of the Rosenberg family have legitimate claims, and different families who entrusted their gold to the Rosenberg Bank also have claims." "So what do we do?" Evan asked. "We do what the original planners intended," Eleanor replied. "We turn the gold over to the appropriate federal authorities and let them work with the courts to determine the proper distribution. It's messy and slow, but it's also fair," Morrison added. "The problem is that once federal authorities get involved, the recovery firms lose their contingency fees. That's why Reed's people are so determined to recover the gold through private channels. They stand to make millions of dollars if they can claim it on behalf of their clients." They emerged from the tunnel into the basement of the library, where Mrs. Patterson kept her office and the historical archives. Eleanor moved immediately to a telephone on Mrs. Patterson's desk and began dialing a number she apparently had memorized. "Who are you calling?" Evan asked. "Sarah Goldstein," Eleanor replied. "She's a federal prosecutor in Philadelphia who specializes in Holocaust asset recovery cases. She's been helping families navigate the legal process for returning stolen property for over 20 years. The conversation that followed was brief but intense, with Eleanor explaining their situation in terms that suggested she'd been preparing for this call for some time. When she hung up, her expression was both relieved and determined. "Sarah is driving down tonight," Eleanor announced. "She'll be here by dawn, along with a team of FBI agents who specialize in this kind of case. They'll take custody of the crash site and begin the formal process of identifying and returning the gold to its rightful owners." Morrison looked skeptical. And you trust federal authorities to handle this properly? Once they take over, we lose all control over what happens. That's exactly the point, Eleanor replied. This isn't our decision to make. The gold belongs to people who suffered under the Nazi regime, and returning it is a matter of justice, not profit. Sophie, who had been listening to the adults debate the moral complexities of their situation, spoke up with the clarity that children often brought to complicated issues. So we just have to make sure the gold gets to the people who can figure out the right thing to do with it, right? We don't have to solve everything ourselves. Her observation cut through the tension and reminded them all of what their real responsibility was. They weren't treasure hunters or legal experts or arbitrators of complex family disputes. They were citizens who had stumbled upon something that belonged to others, and their job was to ensure that it was returned through proper channels. Evan felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not the weight of their financial problems, which remained as pressing as ever, but the weight of trying to solve problems that were beyond their capability to solve. They could do the right thing without being responsible for solving every injustice that had flowed from the original crimes. "All right," he said. "We wait for the federal authorities and we turn everything over to them. But first, we need to make sure that crash site is protected until they get here." Morrison nodded. "Reed's people know the general area, but they don't know the exact location. If we can keep them away from the site until morning, the FBI can take control of the situation." Eleanor was already moving toward the library's main floor, where maps and local records were stored in the reference section. "I have detailed topographical maps of the Miller Farm property. We can identify defensive positions and plan a strategy for protecting the site." As they climbed the stairs to the main floor of the library, Evan realized that their roles had completely reversed from what he'd imagined when they first found the crashed plane. Instead of being treasure hunters trying to claim a fortune, they had become guardians trying to protect historical evidence until it could be properly preserved and returned to its rightful owners. The gold bars in the crashed plane weren't their salvation, they were their sacred trust. And in a few hours, they would discover whether their commitment to doing the right thing was strong enough to withstand the final test that awaited them in the woods behind the Miller farm. Dawn came slowly to the woods behind the Miller farm, filtered through the canopy of oak and maple trees that had stood guard over the crashed transport plane for 70 years. Evan crouched behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the crash site, his work gloves gripping a pair of binoculars that Eleanor had retrieved from the library's emergency kit. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of preparation and positioning. Eleanor had used her detailed knowledge of the property to identify defensive positions, while Morrison had drawn on his military experience to plan fields of fire and communication protocols. Sophie had insisted on remaining with them, despite everyone's attempts to convince her to stay at the library with Mrs. Patterson. "I found it too," she had argued with the stubborn determination that reminded Evan so much of her mother. "And Mom always said that if you start something important, you have to see it through to the end." Now she lay beside him behind the log, using a smaller pair of binoculars to watch the approaches to the crash site. Her calm focus in the face of danger continued to amaze him, though he could see the tension in her small shoulders and the way she gripped the binoculars with white knuckles. Morrison's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie that Eleanor had procured from the library's emergency supplies. "Movement on the east approach. 3 vehicles, maybe 4 personnel per vehicle." Eleanor's voice responded from her position near the old farm road. "I can see them from here. Definitely Reed's people, same white van and black sedans from last night." Evan checked his watch. The federal authorities weren't expected to arrive for another 2 hours, which meant they had to hold the crash site against superior numbers and better equipment for far longer than seemed reasonable. "Remember the plan," Morrison's voice came through the radio. "We're not trying to win a fight. We're just trying to delay them until the FBI gets here." The plan was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. They would use the terrain and their knowledge of the crash site to make it difficult for Reed's people to locate and excavate the plane, while avoiding direct confrontation that could lead to violence. Eleanor had emphasized that they were citizens exercising their legal right to protect evidence of a crime until proper authorities could take custody. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the woods as Reed's team began their approach. Through his binoculars, Evan could see men in tactical gear spreading out in a search pattern, moving with the professional coordination of people who'd done this kind of work before. Sophie tugged on his sleeve and pointed toward a different section of the woods. "Dad, there are more people coming from that direction, but they don't look like the contractor guys." Evan turned his binoculars toward the area Sophie had indicated and was surprised to see a group of what appeared to be local residents moving through the trees. He recognized Jake Morrison among them, along with several other men from the manufacturing plant and a few neighbors from their street. "Eleanor," he whispered into the radio, "we've got civilians approaching from the west, local people." Eleanor's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "I made some phone calls before we left the library. Word has spread about what's happening here, and people are choosing sides." The arrival of local residents transformed the dynamics of the situation completely. What had been a standoff between treasure hunters and a few defenders was now becoming something much larger, a community confrontation between people who believed in following proper legal channels and people who were willing to use force to claim valuable property. Jake's voice called out across the woods, carrying clearly in the morning air. "Marcus Reed, this is private property, and you're trespassing. The Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department has been notified, and federal authorities are en route." Reed's response was amplified by some kind of electronic megaphone. "We represent the legal heirs of the property in question. We have every right to recover assets that belong to our clients." "Then you can wait for the FBI like everyone else," Jake replied. "Until then, you need to leave this property." The standoff continued for several minutes, with both sides maintaining their positions while trying to assess the strength and determination of their opponents. Evan could see that Reed's people were well armed and professionally trained, but they were clearly reluctant to use force against local residents who were simply standing their ground. Sophie had been watching the confrontation with intense concentration, and now she spoke up with an observation that surprised everyone. "Dad, I think some of those contractor guys don't want to be here. Look at the way they're standing, some of them keep looking back toward their cars like they want to leave." Evan studied the tactical team through his binoculars and realized that Sophie was right. While Reed and 2 or 3 of his men appeared committed to recovering the gold regardless of the consequences, several others seemed uncomfortable with the escalating situation. "Morrison," Evan said into the radio. "Sophie thinks some of Reed's people might be having second thoughts about this operation." Morrison's voice carried a note of interest. "That's good intelligence. Professional security contractors don't like operations that involve confronting local civilians. Bad for business and bad for their professional reputations." Eleanor's voice added, "And it's one thing to recover stolen property through aggressive legal tactics. It's another thing entirely to use force against families who are trying to protect historical evidence." The sound of additional vehicles arriving interrupted their strategic discussion. Through the trees, Evan could see more cars parking along the farm, rode not the black sedans and tactical vehicles of Reed's team, but ordinary cars and pickup trucks that belonged to Cedar Falls residents. "How many people did you call?" Morrison asked Eleanor over the radio. "Everyone I could think of," Eleanor replied. "This is about more than just returning stolen gold. It's about who gets to decide how our community handles something this important." Reed's voice came through his megaphone again, but this time it carried a note of frustration rather than authority. "You people are interfering with a legitimate business operation. We have legal standing to recover property that belongs to our clients." Jake's response was supported by a chorus of voices from the local residents. "Then prove it in court like everyone else. Until then, this crash site is under the protection of the Cedar Falls community." The confrontation had evolved from a simple treasure hunt into something much more significant, a test of whether a small community could stand up to outside interests who were willing to use force and intimidation to claim valuable property. The gold bars in the crashed plane had become secondary to the larger question of who had the right to make decisions about matters that affected the entire town. The tension in the woods had been building for over an hour when the sound of helicopters approaching from the east changed everything. Reed's tactical team immediately began looking skyward, their professional demeanor shifting to concern as the aircraft grew louder and more distinct. "Federal birds," Morrison announced over the radio, relief evident in his voice. "Two choppers, probably FBI tactical teams." Through his binoculars, Evan could see Reed arguing with his team leaders, their body language suggesting disagreement about how to proceed now that federal authorities had arrived. Several of Reed's contractors were already moving back toward their vehicles, clearly unwilling to be present when FBI agents began asking questions about their activities. Sophie grabbed her father's arm as the helicopters circled overhead before landing in the clearing beside the old Miller farmhouse. "Dad, look, the contractor guys are leaving." She was right. Reed's white van and one of the black sedans were already pulling away from the scene, leaving only Reed himself and two other men standing in the woods. The arrival of federal authorities had effectively ended the standoff by removing most of Reed's operational capacity. Eleanor's voice came through the radio with barely contained excitement. "The cavalry has arrived, and not a moment too soon." Agents in FBI windbreakers emerged from the helicopters and began establishing a perimeter around the crash site. Their leader, a woman in her 40s with authoritative bearing, approached the group of local residents with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Goldstein," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We're here to take custody of a World War II aircraft crash site and any cargo it may contain. I need everyone to step back and allow my team to secure the area." Jake stepped forward as the unofficial spokesman for the local residents. "Agent Goldstein, we're the people who've been protecting the site until you could get here. We're more than happy to turn it over to proper authorities." Agent Goldstein's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your civic responsibility, but I need everyone to clear the immediate area while my team conducts their investigation." Reed, who had been standing apart from both groups, now approached Agent Goldstein with the confidence of someone who believed he had legal standing. "Agent, I represent the Rosenberg Recovery Foundation. We have documentation showing that our clients are the legal heirs to the cargo in that aircraft." Agent Goldstein studied Reed with the kind of professional assessment that FBI agents reserved for people making claims about federal evidence. "Mr. Reed, I'm familiar with your organization and the legal disputes surrounding Rosenberg family assets. Any claims regarding the contents of this aircraft will be adjudicated through proper federal channels, not through private recovery operations." Reed's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "My clients have been waiting 70 years for justice. They have every right to recover property that was stolen from their family. And they'll have the opportunity to present their claims through the appropriate legal process," Agent Goldstein replied firmly. "But first, we need to properly document and preserve the crash site. This is now a federal crime scene, and anyone who interferes with our investigation will be subject to arrest." Eleanor emerged from her position near the farm road, carrying the folder of documents she'd been protecting throughout the night. "Agent Goldstein, I have historical documentation about the aircraft and its cargo that might be helpful to your investigation." The FBI agent accepted the folder and quickly reviewed its contents, her expression becoming more interested as she read. "This is excellent work, Mrs. Hartwell. These documents will be crucial for establishing the provenance of any recovered materials." Morrison's voice called out from his position near the crash site. "Agent, you should know that the civilians who found this wreck have been protecting it from unauthorized excavation. They're the reason the site is still intact." Agent Goldstein looked toward Evan and Sophie, who were making their way down from their defensive position behind the fallen log. "Mr. Brooks, I presume, and this must be Sophie?" Evan nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of everything they'd been through over the past few days. "Yes, ma'am, We found the plane last weekend while we were metal detecting, and you chose to report it to authorities rather than attempting to recover the cargo yourselves," Agent Goldstein observed. "That took considerable character, especially given your family's financial circumstances." The comment caught Evan off guard. "How do you know about our financial situation?" "Because that's exactly the kind of information we review when assessing the credibility of civilian reports," Agent Goldstein explained. "People who choose to do the right thing when they have every reason to do otherwise are the kind of people we can trust to tell us the truth about what they found." Sophie stepped forward with the directness that had become her trademark throughout this ordeal. "Agent Goldstein, we brought something with us that belongs with the plane." She reached into her backpack and withdrew the single gold bar they'd removed from the crash site during their initial discovery. The metal gleamed in the morning sunlight, and its weight seemed to represent far more than its monetary value. "We took this to prove we'd really found treasure," Sophie explained. "But we realized it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to families who had everything stolen from them, and they should get it back." Agent Goldstein accepted the gold bar with the reverence appropriate to a piece of historical evidence. "This will be catalogued with the rest of the cargo and included in the repatriation process." Reed made one final attempt to assert his client's claims. "Agent, I have legal documentation proving that this gold belongs specifically to the Philadelphia branch of the Rosenberg family. They hired my firm to recover assets that were stolen from their ancestors." "Mr. Reed," Agent Goldstein said with finality, "competing claims regarding Holocaust assets are adjudicated through the federal court system, not through private recovery operations in the woods. Your clients are welcome to file their claims through proper channels, along with any other legitimate heirs." As FBI technicians began establishing their crime scene perimeter around the crash site, Evan felt a profound sense of completion. The gold bars that had seemed like the solution to all their problems had instead become the catalyst for something much more importante, lesson about integrity, community, and the difference between finding treasure and doing what's right. Sophie slipped her hand into his as they watched the federal agents begin their careful excavation of the aircraft. "Dad, I know we're still going to have money problems, but I'm proud of us for giving the gold back." "Me too, kiddo," Evan replied, meaning it completely. "Me too." Reed and his remaining associates departed without further protest, leaving the crash site in the hands of people who understood that some discoveries were too important to be treated as mere treasure. The community of Cedar Falls had stood together to protect something that belonged to others, and in doing so, they had discovered something about themselves that was far more valuable than gold. 6 months later, Evan stood in the same woods behind the Miller farm, watching Sophie operate a new metal detector with the confidence of someone who had learned that the real treasure wasn't always what the machine found, but what you chose to do with the discovery. The crash site had been completely excavated by federal investigators, and the aircraft had been carefully removed to a facility where forensic experts could piece together the final moments of Transport 77 Alpha. The gold had been documented, catalogued, and entered into the complex legal process that would eventually return it to the surviving family members and institutions that had been its intended recipients 70 years ago. The story of their discovery had made national news, not because of the monetary value of the gold, but because of the community's decision to protect historical evidence rather than claim it for personal gain. Eleanor Hartwell had been interviewed by several history magazines about her research, and the Cedar Falls Historical Society had received a federal grant to expand their World War II archives. But the most significant changes had been in Evan's own life. The publicity surrounding their discovery had led to job offers from 3 different companies, all of them impressed by his character and integrity under pressure. He'd accepted a position as a supervisor at a larger manufacturing plant in the next county, a job that paid substantially more than his previous position and came with full health benefits. Margaret had withdrawn her custody petition the week after the FBI concluded their investigation. She'd called to apologize, admitting that she'd underestimated Evan's ability to provide for Sophie and acknowledging that their bond was stronger than any financial advantage she could offer. "I was wrong about you," she'd said during that difficult conversation. "Sarah always believed you were capable of extraordinary things, and she was right." The medical bills that had seemed so insurmountable were being addressed through a combination of his improved income and a charity fund that had been established by grateful Rosenberg family members. Several of the gold's rightful heirs had insisted on recognizing the Brooks family's role in recovering their stolen heritage, despite Evan's protests that they'd simply done what anyone should do. "Dad, listen to this," Sophie called out, interrupting his thoughts. Her new metal detector gift from one of the Rosenberg descendants had begun making the familiar beeping sound that indicated buried metal. Evan walked over to where she was standing, noting how much she'd grown in the past 6 months. She was still the same thoughtful, perceptive child she'd always been, but there was a new confidence in her bearing that came from having faced extraordinary circumstances and emerged with her principles intact. "What do you think it is?" he asked, kneeling beside her as she pinpointed the signal. "Probably just bottle caps," Sophie said with a grin, "but you never know. Maybe it's something that belongs to someone else, and we can help them get it back." They began digging carefully, using the proper archaeological techniques that Eleanor had taught them during the federal investigation. What they found wasn't treasure in any conventional sense, just a corroded metal lunchbox that had probably been lost by a farm worker decades ago. But inside the lunchbox was something more valuable than gold, a collection of photographs showing the Miller family during the farm's productive years, along with letters written by Henry Miller's son during his service in World War II. The documents had been perfectly preserved by the metal container, creating a time capsule of family history that would have been lost forever if they hadn't found it. "We should take these to Mrs. Hartwell," Sophie said, carefully examining the photographs. "She'll know how to find the Miller family and return these to them." Evans smiled at his daughter's instinctive understanding of what they should do. The lesson of the crashed transport plane had become part of who they were, people who found things that belonged to others and made sure they were returned to their rightful homes. As they packed up their equipment and prepared to head back to their truck, Evan reflected on how much their lives had changed since that first weekend when Sophie had insisted they explore the woods behind the Miller farm. They'd found treasure that day, but not the kind either of them had expected. The real treasure had been the discovery that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, could lead to outcomes that were better than anything they could have imagined for themselves. The gold bars were gone, distributed to families who deserved justice after decades of waiting. But the experience of protecting something that belonged to others had revealed strengths and values that would serve them well for the rest of their lives. "Dad," Sophie said as they walked back through the woods, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd kept the gold instead of giving it back?" Evan considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. We could have paid off all our debts and secured your college fund. We could have bought a bigger house and taken vacations and never worried about money again. But would we have been happy?" Sophie asked. The question cut to the heart of everything they'd learned. "I don't think so," Evan said honestly. "I think we would have spent the rest of our lives wondering if we'd done the right thing, and I think your mother would have been disappointed in us." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "I think so too. Besides, we're doing okay now, aren't we? We have enough money for the important things, and we know that when we find something that belongs to someone else, we're the kind of people who give it back." As they reached the truck and loaded their equipment, Evan realized that Sophie had articulated something profound about the nature of contentment and moral satisfaction. They had enough money for the important things, and more importantly, they had proven to themselves that they were people of integrity. The new metal detector sat in the back of the truck beside the old one. They'd started with the $15 garage sale device that had led them to the greatest discovery of their lives. Not the discovery of gold, but the discovery of what they were capable of when circumstances tested their character. Driving home through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, Evan reflected on Sarah's favorite saying about good things coming to people who don't give up. She'd been right. but not in the way either of them had expected. The good things hadn't come because they'd found treasure. They'd come because they'd found the strength to do what was right with the treasure they'd discovered. Sophie fell asleep in the passenger seat, her hand still clutching one of the photographs from the Miller family's lost lunchbox. Tomorrow, they would return these family memories to their rightful owners, continuing the mission that had begun with a crashed transport plane and a cargo of stolen gold. The metal detector would keep beeping, and they would keep searching, hunting for hope in all the places where lost things waited to be found and returned to the people who valued them most.